Protists, Section 13.3. By the end of this video, you will be able to describe the main characteristics of protists. Figure 13.13. Protists range from the microscopic single-celled Acanthocystis terfacea or Acanthocystis terfacea and the ciliate Tetrahymena thermophila to the enormous multicellular kelps, chromalveolata, that extend for hundreds of feet in underwater forests. Eukaryotic organisms that did not fit the criteria for the kingdoms Animalia, fungi, or plantae historically were called protists and were classified into the kingdom Protista. Protists include the single-celled eukaryotes living in pond water, although protist species live in a variety of other aquatic and terrestrial environments and occupy many different niches. Not all protists are microscopic and single-celled. There exist some very large multicellular species, such as the kelps. During the past 2 decades, the field of molecular genetics has demonstrated that some protists are more related to animals, plants, or fungi than they are to other protists. For this reason, protist lineages originally classified into the kingdom Protista have been reassigned into new kingdoms or other existing kingdoms. The evolutionary lineages of the protists continue to be examined and debated. In the meantime, the term protist still is used informally to describe this tremendously diverse group of eukaryotes. As a collective group, protists display an astonishing diversity of morphologies, physiologies, and ecologies. Welcome back to Concepts of Biology. We'll continue with Section 13.3, Characteristics of Protists. There are over 100,000 described living species of protists, and it is unclear how many undescribed species may exist. Since many protists live in symbiotic relationships with other organisms, and these relationships are often species-specific, there is a huge potential for undescribed protist diversity that matches the diversity of the hosts. As the catch-all term for eukaryotic organisms that are not animals, plants, fungi, or any single phylogenetically related group, it is not surprising that few characteristics are common to all protists. Nearly all protists exist in some type of aquatic environment, including freshwater and marine environments, damp soil, and even snow. Several protist species are parasites that infect animals or plants. A parasite is an organism that lives on or in another organism and feeds on it, often without killing it. A few protist species live on dead organisms or their wastes and contribute to their decay. Protist structure. The cells of protists are among the most elaborate of all cells. Most protists are microscopic and unicellular, but some true multicellular forms exist. A few protists live as colonies that behave in some ways as a group of free-living cells and in other ways as a multicellular organism. Still, other protists are composed of enormous multinucleate single cells that look like amorphous blobs of slime or, in some cases, like ferns. In fact, many protist cells are multinucleated. In some species, the nuclei are different sizes and have distinct roles in protist cell function. Single protist cells range in size from less than a micrometer to the 3-meter lengths of the multinucleate cells of the seaweed Caulerpa. Protist cells may be enveloped by animal-like cell membranes or plant-like cell walls. Others are encased in glassy silica-based shells or wound with pellicles of interlocking protein strips. The pellicle functions like a flexible coat of armor, preventing the protist from being torn or pierced without compromising its range of motion. The majority of protists are motile, but different types of protists have evolved varied modes of movement. Some protists have one or more flagella which they rotate or whip. Others are covered in rows or tufts of tiny cilia that they beat in coordination to swim. Still others send out lobe-like pseudopodia from anywhere on the cell, anchor the pseudopodium to a substrate, and pull the rest of the cell toward the anchor point. Some protists can move toward light by coupling their locomotion strategy with a light-sensing organ. How protists obtain energy. Protists exhibit many forms of nutrition and may be aerobic or anaerobic. Photosynthetic protists, or photoautotrophs, are characterized by the presence of chloroplasts. Other protists are heterotrophs and consume organic materials such as other organisms to obtain nutrition. Amoebas and some other heterotrophic protist species ingest particles by a process called phagocytosis, in which the cell membrane engulfs a food particle and brings it inward, pinching off an intracellular membranous sac or vesicle called a food vacuole. This vesicle then fuses with a lysosome, and the food particle is broken down into small molecules that can diffuse into the cytoplasm and be used in cellular metabolism. Undigested remains ultimately are expelled from the cell through exocytosis. Figure 13.14. The stages of phagocytosis include the engulfment of a food particle, the digestion of the particle using hydrolytic enzymes contained within a lysosome, and the expulsion of undigested material from the cell. Some heterotrophs absorb nutrients from dead organisms or their organic wastes, and others are able to use photosynthesis or feed on organic matter, depending on conditions. Reproduction. Protists reproduce by a variety of mechanisms. Most are capable of some form of asexual reproduction, such as binary fission to produce two daughter cells, or multiple fission to divide simultaneously into many daughter cells. Others produce tiny buds that go on to divide and grow to the size of the parental protists. Sexual reproduction, including meiosis and fertilization, is common among protists, and many protist species can switch from asexual to sexual reproduction when necessary. Sexual reproduction is often associated with periods when nutrients are depleted or environmental changes occur. Sexual reproduction may allow the protist to recombine genes and produce new variations of progeny that may be better suited to surviving in the new environment. However, sexual reproduction is also often associated with cysts that are a protective resting stage. Depending on their habitat, the cysts may be particularly resistant to temperature extremes, desiccation, or low pH. This strategy also allows certain protists to wait out stressors until their environment becomes more favorable for survival, or until they are carried, such as by wind, water, or transport on a larger organism to a different environment, because cysts exhibit virtually no cellular metabolism. Share the link. We want these free textbook resources to be available to other students. All right, let's get back to reading. Now on to protist diversity.